Okay, what is formal thought disorder? I've just made the what is schizophrenia video, and I'm making the what is formal thought disorder video straight after because they're connected, right? So much like schizophrenia, people have been trying to define formal thought disorder or thought disorder, depending on which you prefer, for a long time. And attempts to define formal thought disorder have actually run parallel to those of schizophrenia. So, like when you go and look at what's the history of attempts to define schizophrenia? You start with Kraepelin and Bloiler. When you go to, okay, what are the attempts to define formal thought disorder? You also end up on Kraepelin and Bloiler. So attempts to describe formal thought disorder have run a very parallel historical course to that of schizophrenia itself. It's probably, whereas schizophrenia is probably the most studied mental disorder, formal thought disorder is probably the most studied symptom of schizophrenia. But formal thought disorder also pops up in other clinical pictures like autism and mania, in relation to bipolar and the affective psychoses. And so one of the most important things to think about when it comes to formal thought disorder is, first of all, let's work out whether we need the word formal. So in some areas of the research, researchers say, like if you go back to say like, I don't know, the pre-Andreasen, the pre-TLC scale era, a lot of researchers are talking about formal thought disorder, and that's the idea of, in psychiatry, the difference between the form and the content of thoughts. So like delusions would be under content, and disorganized speech would be under form. And so form in this case refers to the kind of shape of the thoughts. And that's related to this idea that if you want to understand what's going on inside a patient's head, you have to use their language as a proxy. So you're getting this second order representation of the psychopathology, right? So when you're talking about the form of the thoughts, you're really talking about the form of the thoughts as indicated by the speech. So there's that. But then in more contemporary formal thought disorder research, people advocate for dropping the formal and just calling it thought disorder. I have no strong opinions. I chose to call it formal thought disorder primarily because early in my PhD, that's what I was reading. I was reading the early stuff. So in that context, that's what it was called. And then, as I moved through the project, I was like, do I drop formal? And I thought, no, not really, because I'm including pre and post TLC scale authors in my work. So I may as well just for kind of, to capture everybody's ideas, I'll just stick with formal. But I'm absolutely fine with people who say, oh, you don't need the formal, you can just say thought disorder. Much like schizophrenia symptoms, formal thought disorder symptoms have been grouped according to factor analysis, and you've got positive and negative and disorganization, and you can kind of group them in that way. The only one that's tricky is poverty of content of speech, which is saying a lot without communicating a lot. So, is that a positive symptom in that there's more speech, it's saying a lot, it's adding more speech, or is it a negative symptom in that it's removing communicative success? It's like the message isn't getting across. And yeah, it's like, apart from that though, you can look at formal thought disorder very much in the same way that you look at schizophrenia, like heterogeneous expression. The difference though is that formal thought disorder is considered to be transdiagnostic because it pops up in autism and mania and so on. But when they've done linguistic profiling research on the different manifestations of thought disorder in different clinical pictures, they've found evidence to suggest that actually the formal thought disorder that you see in autism might differ qualitatively and quantitatively from the formal thought disorder in mania, right? And a lot of the work I've done and looked at supports this idea. So there's that to consider. So if you're doing formal thought disorder research, or you're doing thought disorder research and you want to understand it, you're probably better off looking at thought disorder in schizophrenia or in autism or in bipolar, without just looking at it in everyone and then trying to generalize it to everyone, because there's evidence that suggests that's not the best idea. a great book on this, again, McKenna. So, whereas if you want to understand schizophrenia, you should look at schizophrenia and related syndromes. McKenna also has another book out that I need to read, which is about delusions and language, which is an amazing area to look at. The sort of role of language in delusions. I'm well on board with that. From an anecdotal perspective, that's absolutely spot on. But obviously, from an academic perspective, I need to read it to, understand it. But yeah, McKenna wrote a book called Schizophrenic Speech, Making Sense of Bath Roots and Ponds That Fall in Doorways, with Thomasina O, who has done work on thought disorder. And much like schizophrenia and related syndromes, that book is really methodical, and it says, let's look at all the different approaches and hypotheses. Let's look at the dysexecutive hypothesis. Let's look at the dysemantic hypothesis. Let's look at it as a form of dysphasia. It goes on. Fantastic book. So, but it's very similar to schizophrenia in that there is this sort of heterogeneous expression of it. You talk to one patient with thought disorder and they may show clanging, the tendency to speak in rhyme. You talk to another patient with thought disorder and they may have poverty of speech and not much else. So it's almost like a kind of, it sort of resembles schizophrenia, but it's a language syndrome rather than a more comprehensive clinical syndrome like schizophrenia. So it's a fascinating area. There's been quite a bit of research on it. There hasn't been so much research by linguists. There's what Chaika did in the 80s. I think Chaika wrote a paper called A Linguist's View of Formal Thought Disorder, or A Linguist's Take. And Covington did a really nice review, sort of using linguistic techniques and terms and approaches to thought disorder descriptions. And I did something similar. I kind of was inspired by Covington's review to do to kind of build a framework, a kind of linguistically informed framework of pre and post TLC positions. The TLC is probably the most significant development. The Thought, Language and Communication Scale by Nancy Andreasen. Now, Nancy Andreasen was a professor of literature before she trained as a psychiatrist, so she had this strong background in language and literary analysis before becoming a psychiatrist. And so when she looks at language and psychosis, you can see in some of the research that she's done and so on, that kind of literary influence. And she's done a couple of studies where she asked clinicians, to rate formal thought disorder in different writing samples, and there was, a schizophrenia with thought disorder group, a mania group, and a creative writing group with no pathology or no diagnosis. And in that experiment, which was some time ago, things have changed since then clinically, but in that experiment, the clinicians gave the creative writers and the mania sample the higher thought disorder ratings, and they gave the schizophrenia sample the lowest thought disorder ratings. And they didn't identify that there was a non-psychotic cohort in the sample. So one of the takeaways from that was, maybe clinicians at that time had this idea that formal thought disorder was this very literary thing. And that led Andreasen to sort of redefine the clinical concept of thought disorder, by developing the Thought, Language and Communication Scale, which is like an 18-item rating scale. Since then, there have been quite a few studies on thought disorder that have used the TLC scale as its measurement tool. And there are other rating scales. There's the Clang, the TAL, the TLI, most of which are derivatives of the TLC. The nice thing about the TAL is that it includes subjective and objective measures of thought disorder. So it includes the patient's perspective on their speech. So it kind of builds metacognition and metalinguistic awareness into the instrument, which is really important. And that's something that I didn't explicitly do when I developed my own framework. I suppose where my work is slightly different is I took the most prominent researchers prior to Andreasen, and then I took Andreasen and I put them in a kind of chronological order, and I included everyone. Whereas what Andreasen did was she selected from everyone before her what she agreed with clinically and excluded a lot of stuff, and then introduced a lot of new stuff that she'd seen in clinical practice that the guys and, the researchers prior to her hadn't seen or reported. And so when I was looking at this, I was like, oh, that's a shame. A lot of the stuff that got thrown out in the TLC scale, it would have been nice to see how that holds up against contemporary language samples, right? So to account for this, what I did was I just included everyone. I said, well, let's just put everybody in a bucket and then try and sort through what's in the bucket and see where they are in relation to some sort of linguistic framework. And in the end, I came up with 4 things. So whether you're pre-Andreasen or whether you're Andreasen, everybody's talking about the same 4 things: grammar, word selection, thought completion, and discourse tracking. So if you're a clinician and you're like looking at assessing thought disorder, and you find doing something like a full rating scale with the TLC or the TLI or the TALD quite difficult in a clinical interview context, you can just look for those 4 things. Like, is the patient's speech grammatical? Are they selecting words appropriately? Or are they introducing sort of neologisms and archaisms and sort of that sort of thing? Are they completing their thoughts, or are their sentences sort of trailing off after 2 words? Or are there large gaps or pauses? And are they tracking and monitoring the discourse? So are they saying things like, as I said a minute ago, or showing other signs that they're following the discourse, like taking turns in the appropriate places and referencing to earlier parts of the discourse or not? Or are they introducing non sequiturs, kind of replies that don't follow what preceded them, and that sort of thing? So that's my suggestion. It's called the 4TD framework. It's like a linguistically informed model of thought disorder that tries to include everybody. That's available as a preprint. But that's kind of the lowdown. That's kind of the gist on thought disorder. There's a lot more interest in it now. When I was doing my PhD, very little sort of interest in language in psychosis, specifically looking at thought disorder and schizophrenia. I don't know whether it's because I'm no longer working on my PhD and therefore I've sort of stopped hyper-focusing on my own work and I've started, paying attention to what's going on around me, or if there has been a kind of explosion in thought disorder research, but I feel like there has been. I'm seeing a lot more projects pop up now where thought disorder is sexy now. It wasn't sexy when I was working on it. But I think some of that has to do with the ICD-11, because before the ICD-11, disorganized speech was very low down, and historically it was not considered diagnostically significant. It was like, this doesn't tell us anything about the patient's diagnosis. Like, it's an interesting observation that they've got disorganized speech, but it's not diagnostically relevant. But then ICD-11 came along and bumped thought disorder up to be on par in diagnostic significance with delusions and hallucinations. And now everything's changed. Everybody's interested now. So, it's one to watch. If you're interested in thought disorder research, I'd love to chat to you. But yeah, that's the long and the short of it.